West is not in imminent decline, that our demise is not certain, that Western civilization has not seen its best days yet. And in fact, what we are experiencing is a reboot, a rebirth, if you will, a neo-renaissance, because that, ladies and gentlemen, is the purpose of the hero's journey that men like you watching this have gone through. Those elites, that cross-section, they dominate, control, they've infected all Western countries, and the results are the same everywhere. But the positive result of that is that we're all being forced to see the same things, and therefore we can fight it the same way, and we can help each other fight it together. The archetypes that define who we are, that make us Western animals, humans, psycho-spiritual beings, those archetypes are going to reassert themselves and rebirth Western civilization in the process. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope all of you are doing well. My apologies for not having put out a video sooner, but generally speaking, I try to take August off, and I am currently in Prague, one of my favorite cities in the world, a city built by Holy Roman emperors like Charles II, a city made famous by surrealist writers like Franz Kafka, who was born here, and composers like Antonin Dvorak, and at one time or other, the center, if you will, may be the capital of alchemy. It was a time under Rudolph II when folks like John Dee, who was Elizabeth I's alchemist, astrologer, magician, if you will, her shaman, came here to Prague to mingle and mix with others like him. Today's video is going to be about that very topic of sorts. It's going to be about an awakening, an alchemical shift, as I like to say it on this channel. We are in the midst of an awakening, but I want to walk through this episodically. I want to talk our way through how we've arrived here, because I think that will help us understand better where we are headed. It's no surprise to anybody who's watched my channel, but if you haven't seen it before, I take a very different perspective from most in the online right, who are fixed, if you will, on a framework, on an understanding of the world that's derived from the 19th century, that largely is informed by the revolutionaries who frequented the cafes of cities in Prague and Vienna and Budapest and other places like that across Europe. And it was their belief that Western peoples, that Western men, were basically caught in some kind of an oppressive system, that they did not have agency, that they could not really fight back except through some kind of violent revolution. Of course, this was only manifested, it was only materialized in some sense with an undercurrent of nationalism, because that was the only way you could really operationalize those animal spirits. In any case, that idea has become so powerful, so strong, that the opposition to that sort of communist-like thinking has itself bought into the premises that underlie it, namely that there are these invisible systems of domination. There are these super elites that are playing video games in God mode, and on that basis, they're orchestrating chess pieces, and they're the kings or queens, and we are their pawns. That's the full story. There's little to nothing we can do about it. Our movements will be infiltrated, they will be contaminated and repurposed towards some kind of arcane or subterranean agenda, something that obviously conflicts with our Western Christian values. Well, needless to say, that fantasy, I think, is dying. So this video, I want to break it down in 5 different parts. The first, I'm going to talk about the apocalypse, the birthplace, the embryonic stage, if you will, of the awakening. The second part, I'm going to talk about the storm, the abyss that apocalyptic moment has sent us into. Then I want to talk about the resistance and its various incantations. And then I want to talk about a kind of mass mobilization that I think is imminent, a term that I've used before. And I want to close with this idea that the West is not in imminent decline, that our demise is not certain, that Western civilization has not seen its best days yet. And in fact, what we are experiencing is a reboot, a rebirth, if you will, a neo renaissance, because that, ladies and gentlemen, is the purpose of the hero's journey that men like you watching this have gone through over the last 20, 30, hell, 50, maybe even 100 years, certainly since the European civil wars that dominated the 20th century. Apocalypse is a Greek word, and it means to reveal. It does not necessarily mean end times. It means to reveal. And that process of revelation, as far as I can tell, began at the end of the 90s. Certainly it did for me. The 90s was a time of abundance. It was a time of nostalgia. It was a time of bliss to some degree. One of the most iconic films of the 90s was a film called Clueless. Now, Clueless is a uniquely American film about a particular mode of life that is distinctly American. But I do think that following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a sense in the 90s of calm, a sense of victory, of triumph, a sense that the United States had achieved Roman-like status, that we were living in Pax Americana. Well, I think all that changed around 1999. 1999 was an interesting year, to be sure, especially so in film. And this is something I've talked about before, but there are a few films that I want to call your attention to. The first, and potentially the most important of which, is The Matrix. And The Matrix was a film that was about one thing, and that is an awakening. It was about the recognition that there was something wrong with the world, and that we had a choice. We could either accept this world as contrived, as structured, or we could take the red pill and try to see what lies beneath. And obviously that struck a chord. And I think it struck a chord in ways that transcend the graphics on set, right? The tremendous visuals and imagery that came across in the film, which were quite revolutionary at the time, but it tapped into our psyches. It struck a nerve, as they say. The next film that similarly made a huge impact, particularly on men, was Fight Club. And Fight Club, to summarize in one word, was about rebellion. Now, at the time, of course, it wasn't exactly understood. What are we rebelling against? What is this system that bedevils us? All that we knew is that there was something about the film that captured us, that spoke to us, particularly young men, as I said. And in the film itself, the core elements of the system were consumerism, maybe mass conformity, certainly a hint of emasculation. It anticipates things like feminism and wokeness. In any case, there was a sense of compression, of grittiness, that modernity itself was a problem because it had evacuated mankind of a soul. Our spirit, particularly masculine spirit, was emasculated. It was despiritualized. And I think even though we didn't fully understand the implications, the meaning of the film, it acquired a following because, as I said, people, for whatever reason, they seemed to sense that there was something going on there that was applicable to our lives and the lives of everybody around us. The next two films are a little bit different, but I think equally are just as important, and they were just as obscure, mysterious, and a bit befuddling when they came out. The first is Eyes Wide Shut, and Eyes Wide Shut, which was the last film made by Stanley Kubrick, was a film about corruption at very elite levels, corruption of high society, corruption of concentrations of power and wealth. And it was about the occult. It was about some kind of satanic, dark underpinning that had its grip on power. Analogous to that was The Ninth Gate, and The Ninth Gate was sort of the hero's journey to some degree of a satanic figure. But in order to ascend the mountain of Satan, or of dark energy, or the darkness, he has to do what? He has to sort of enter into the world of the elites. So the motifs are very similar and overlap quite well with Eyes Wide Shut. And both directors, Stanley Kubrick on the one hand and Polanski on the other, seemed to be pointing at some kind of elite structure that was a bit hidden, that our eyes couldn't exactly make out, that was orchestrating tremendous power in ways that were destructive, not just to themselves, obviously, but to the world around them. What later that would communicate, I think, is this curiosity, this fear to some degree, that I talk about on this show all the time, namely that the elite cadre are not just evil, but that they have awesome power, okay? But at the time these films were made, there just wasn't a solid or clear understanding of that. So it is quite amazing that all four of these films, The Matrix, Fight Club, Eyes Wide Shut, and The Ninth Gate, were sort of communicating something. What I think they were communicating is a kind of alchemical earthquake, that there was something wrong with the world. Again, that there was a system that was beguiling us, that was blinding us from the truth, that modernity was compressing us in ways that were despiritualizing, and that there were elite powers in this world that weren't fully understood. And we set about trying to understand all of these things, whether it was the surreal system that we were inculcated in, or it was the compressive forces that we felt, and of course these sort of arcane groups that have since to some degree been revealed. More on that later. In any event, this was sort of a precursor to what was about to happen, and very specifically in 1999, guess what? You get a school shooting. And a lot of people today don't remember Columbine, but Columbine was the beginning of this epoch of mass shootings that we've come to some degree expect. I mean, it's almost normalized in the United States, and obviously there's a lot of political arguments on both sides, and I want to avoid all that because I think what's more important is the cause, is what it represents. And I think these young men in '99, and I think I was a freshman in high school in Colorado when it happened, they were severely disturbed. They were not necessarily nutcases as much as the community around them and themselves. There was some kind of spiritual failure. And I think we couldn't grasp that at the time. It was just so awful and so horrifying to process that students could do this. But it, at the same time, communicated that we were in a different world. Of course, shortly thereafter, we find ourselves in the storm that became GWOT, or the Global War on Terrorism. And of course, that was the 2001 event. And that event was quite shocking too. Again, I remember being in high school and watching it on television because it was all over the news, and it was sort of a surreal experience. Hard to imagine that something on that scale, that an attack that blatant, that egregious, that costly could occur on American soil, particularly in New York City, which is sort of an iconic symbol of American financial, economic, industrial power. In any case, that too communicated that, well, whatever we were living in the 90s, that's over now, and a new world is beginning. And so that became the global war on terrorism, and all of a sudden everything started to change. Security became top of mind, and the surveillance state, as we now know, took full advantage of that. You had something called the Patriot Act, one piece of legislation ahead of many that were Orwellian in the very literal sense of the word. And obviously that then became the wellspring of a massive growth of interconnectedness and surveillance in ways that humanity never experienced before. Everything that we did and said was recorded, it's collated, it's tracked, and now our sense of privacy is almost completely gone. And layer on top of layer on top of layer, including platforms like YouTube, walking around making videos like this is now the norm. It was something impossible to imagine even in the 90s, which just isn't all that long ago. But nonetheless, that sense, again, that this sort of subterranean or this darkness that we couldn't quite understand, couldn't quite see, and maybe didn't want to think or acknowledge in the 90s, that was now front and center. Of course, the nature of things like 9/11 the global war on terrorism, occupying, destroying countries in the Middle East, defining or characterizing whole nations as axes of evil. That no doubt was disturbing, but the story as it evolved turned out very differently than what we originally thought it was going to be. Of course, most people, even then, with very few exceptions like Alex Jones, for example, more or less accepted what the government had to say. A few didn't, and that seed began to sprout. Doubts about the legitimacy of 9/11 itself, just as doubts about the Kennedy administration, or the Kennedy assassination, I should say, those doubts really began to flower. They began to spread. And I think within just a few years of the global war on terrorism and the disaster that it was, costing trillions of dollars, killing certainly hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, just displacing millions of people, which included destabilizing an entire region and then sort of spreading discontent directed at the United States around the world. These things soured the patriotic verve that was the immediate reaction to 9/11 and the global war on terrorism. Then came 2008. And 2008 is a lot more significant to millennials and Gen Z than I think a lot of people of older generations understand. Because when that event happened, our mode of livelihood, our standard of living changed in ways that were completely irreparable, or at least changed to such an extent that we could not go back. We could not live the way that our parents lived. We could not enjoy the prosperity that those older generations had. And I think here we are, 2025. So what's that? 17 years, some odd years later, our failure to launch economically has scarred us. It's done a lot of damage to us. There's no question about that. Then comes this figure in Donald Trump, I would say, in 2016. And Donald Trump himself was sort of like a hurricane. I've talked about this before. But whatever you may think of Donald Trump, and I'm certainly not his biggest fan, this was another moment in which the edifice of power was sort of rattled by the masses. Now, Donald Trump certainly attributed most of that to his own megalomania, his own imprint, his own movement, but really he was expressing a broad-based frustration with the current state of affairs in the West. And obviously this was not just economic. This was also about the Great Replacement. This was also about a society whose national identity had been whittled down to nothing and whose elites had betrayed the ethnos, betrayed the identity of the country that had basically sold out. And it also exposed the systemic level of corruption at all levels, right? It wasn't just the Democratic Party. It wasn't just Hillary Clinton or the Clinton machine, right? It wasn't just dirty politicians. This time, it was entire agencies in the federal government. It was intelligence agencies. It was the Department of State. Maybe it was the attorneys general. Who knows? Whatever the case may be, there was systemic fraud, corruption, the orchestration of power towards evil ends. And Donald Trump, to his credit, to some degree, by being victimized by it himself, and as a representative of us, exposed it. All of those things led eventually to 2020 and the pandemic, yet another sort of tidal wave of reality washing over a population that's just trying to reorient itself, that's just trying to understand what the hell is going on. So all of these things together, and the dominoes that have been falling since COVID, this war in Russia, the Zionist expansion, the militant Zionism in the Middle East, the specter of a global war, all of these things have all of a sudden sprouted out of nowhere. This is sort of the storm. This is the abyss that all of us have fallen into. It's sort of like Neo being dropped into that liquid pool right before he's then lifted out. That's what's happened to us. And it's been very difficult to reorient ourselves as a result. And then, of course, you had things like online dating. You had the weaponization of the gender roles or of women against men, right? You had the emergence of social media. You had new ways of communication, of developing relationships with people from around the world, people that were not in close proximity. Again, another dynamic change. And there's countless others, right? Obviously, we have things like cryptocurrency, we have artificial intelligence. So all of these things together cause this sort of storm that sent us into an abyss. That brings me to the third piece, the resistance. As we have tried to ferociously hold on to the roller coaster of the last 20, 25 years, we have gotten stronger, contrary to what a lot of people will tell you. We've actually become more resolute. We've become thicker skinned. We have a tougher exterior. We have a more skeptical mind. And for many of us, our intellectual depth is far deeper than we could ever have imagined, in some sense because of isolation, because of hardship, because of the acrimony in the sexual marketplace, or in our office job, right? Or in the university that we attend. Maybe it's Starbucks, who knows? Maybe with family members. Either way, we have actually become more resistant. And that resistance, unwittingly or otherwise, in my view, spontaneously, has begun to, or began to, reorganize itself. This was the birthplace of the Red Pill community, or the Manosphere community. Eventually, you had groups like the Groypers. All of these various communities sprouted up because there was a sense of resistance. There was an intolerance that was festering among masses of men who had had enough. They were sick of the lies. They were tired of the mainstream narrative. They no longer believed in the legacy paradigm, certainly not of their parents, but they don't believe what the government says. They don't believe what prominent Fortune 500 CEOs say. They don't believe what the tech gurus say, right? There's a sense of distrust that's systemic, that's deep, and that's wide. But nonetheless, it has clustered various groups of men into a resistance. But that leads to a very obvious question. Resistance to what exactly? Well, certainly there are these pernicious ideas. Obviously, there are these systemic forces that are arrayed against us. Things like central banking, things like censorship, things like big government or the deep state. You know, these are the various terms that are used. But basically, resistance, I would say, to three things. One is the financial elite. And we all know who they are, don't need to spell it out. But this is a group of folks that monopolize and control the system whose base layer is the financial system. These are people like Larry Fink. These are people like George Soros. These are Wall Street hedge fund managers, central bankers. These are sort of the merchants of finance that Carroll Quigley talks about in his famous book, Hope and Tragedy, or Tragedy and Hope. That's the first group. And a lot of work has been done exploring exactly how that group has made all of its money, the nature, the mechanisms by which they have destroyed economy in the Western world, the sort of economic hitman mentality that has been unleashed on the world without any real safeguards or restraint. That's the first batch of elites, and I think that's the most important. So if you really want to understand what's going on today, you really have to explore, you have to delve deeply into the financial system to understand exactly how it works, and a lot of you have done that. The second group, I think, are the Zionists, and the Zionists are a particular group of elites, primarily in the United States. I don't think they're primarily in Israel at all, by the way, who, by virtue of commanding colossal fortunes and estates have pushed American foreign policy in particular, but also repurposed American democracy towards one end, and that is basically towards supporting the Jewish state in all its endeavors, regardless of what it wants to do and regardless of the negative consequences to itself or the United States. And this group obviously comports with the neoconservatives. Some people talk about the Straussians. And the epicenter of the Zionist project, as I've talked about before, is AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee. That's well known at this point. I think a viral acknowledgement of who they are, a disclosure of the machine politics that is AIPAC, has come to the fore since 2023. But it's not really about Israel. This is about a lot of people in the United States who masquerade as Americans, but ultimately they are Zionists. The third group, and potentially the most destructive of them all, are the cultural revolutionaries, right? So you have the financial elite, you have the Zionists, and you sort of have the revolutionary elite. And the revolutionary elite also consists of people like George Soros. Soros is an interesting person because he's in both camps. He's both one of the financial elites, somebody like Larry Fink, but he's also revolutionary. Somebody like Noam Chomsky, for example. Noam Chomsky is an intellectual, yeah, but he's a revolutionary. And what he represents is the Frankfurt School that's advocating for the subversion and undermining Western civilization however it can. So as the resistance has come to define itself, has come to be aware of itself, it is those three pillars that it is keenly focused on. And of course, underneath those three, potentially there, or rather above those three, potentially there's even more. And this references somebody like Jeffrey Epstein and his criminality, and how deep that rabbit hole goes, I don't know, but I think we'll find out. In any case, what all of this is leading us to, I think, is some kind of mass mobilization event, some kind of an explosion on the streets. And what's happening today is that the resistance that's coagulated online is now beginning to hit the street level. And this is what you're beginning to see across European countries. Now, I have said before, and part of the reason I'm in Europe is because I believe that there must be continuity between what happens in Europe and what happens in the West, number one. And number two, I believe that what's happening in the West is actually starting here in Europe and will lag in the United States. And I say that for a couple reasons. One is I think that Europeans have a deeper sense of their national identity. They have a stronger sense of history, of provenance, and I think their political acumen is much better than ours. And just to be clear, when I say that, what I mean is that in the United States, we even had to create a new party for over a century. When politics changes, when you get to these end of cycles, you have to build new organizations. You have to scale new kinds of political things. We don't have much experience doing that in the United States because we haven't had to. Politics, in many ways, for most of American history, has been completely irrelevant. Most of our history is focused on what happens outside of government, not what happens inside of it. And there are many reasons for that that go beyond the scope of this video. In any case, what's happening in Europe, this wave of nationalism that's concentrated in men, right? What I call masco-nationalism, that is now acquiring scalability. It's now becoming viral. And it's becoming viral in such a way that is infectious to other European countries. Imitation is a very powerful thing. There are specific neurons in our brain that activate imitation. And one of the ways that we do that is by putting ourselves in the shoes of others, is by relating to them, not just in a vision, but emotionally, maybe psycho-spiritually, who knows? But to some degree by assuming their presence, their mentality. And so what's happening in countries like England and France and Germany and Spain is not peculiar to those countries. All Western nations are basically on the same trajectory. We're all hostage to the same poisonous ideas that are perpetuated by the same evil system who's dominated by the same evil elites. That means that if there's revolutionary activity in England, it's going to activate the animal spirits in the United States and vice versa. This is a kind of mass mobilization meta-political moment that goes well beyond voting for your local delegate or campaigning for Congress. Not that those things are bad or that they're irrelevant, but what I'm talking about is much, much bigger. And essentially, the prevailing fact of our time, which is something that continues to be denied by people on the online right in particular, is that a big part of what's enabling this is accelerationism. It's that problems are really bad. They're inescapable. And so people, what we call normies, who ordinarily speaking would ignore politics, and for good reason, they just want to live their lives. They just want to earn a paycheck. They just want to live a normal life, okay? They're now affected. They're affected economically, they're affected psychically, right? Because they're noticing that their neighborhoods don't look the same, they don't feel safe, they feel a sense of insecurity, of loneliness, and they expect that the political system will respond to those grievances. Of course, you and I know that that's not going to happen, that the state itself is incapable of correcting itself, that democracy is a fraud, it's a sham. And that brings me to the pillars that are unifying this meta-political mass mobilization, and that is threefold. The first is an awareness of the elites. I talked about this before, the financial elites, the Zionist elites, and the revolutionary elites. That's the first pillar. Those elites, that cross-section, they dominate, control, they've infected all Western countries, and the results are the same everywhere. But the positive result of that is that we're all being forced to see the same things, and therefore we can fight it the same way, and we can help each other fight it together. The second is race realism. I don't think I need to spell this one out, but we're recognizing that you can't transform people, that they are what they are, which is why there are these things called nations, and nations tend to coalesce around peoples, and peoples are different. And those differences vary, to be sure, but when you have a civilization like the West, the differences between Italians and Germans and Poles and Czechs and Americans and so forth, they're just not going to be very significant. They exist, they're real, but more or less these differences can be overcome. That is the extent of assimilation. I don't like that term, but if there is such a thing, that's the extent of it. But when you have peoples from other civilizations, or potentially other parts of the world that don't have civilization at all, that are completely barbaric and live in a kind of thugocracy, well, we've seen the result of that. And that is the breakdown of our civilizations, the breakdown of law and order. And obviously the state, in its attempt to sort of manage these differences by redistribution, by government initiatives that re-educate the population by propagandizing, et cetera, or by censorship, that paradigm is done. It's over. Nobody buys any of this crap. And the financial system itself that subsidizes the welfare state that's necessary to lubricate all of these social frictions, well, needless to say, that's completely unsustainable, and it's eating away at the very economic growth, at the very economic machinery that's required to activate and subsidize the welfare state itself. Never mind the problems in the sexual marketplace, which discourage the productivity of men anyway. So you add all of these things up, and you're in a very precarious situation. You're in a nuclear silo, and you've lost control of the reactor. And that's where we are today. However, the result of this is not going to be what all of these black pill doomers fear. It's not going to go that way. In part because it's self-evident, right? The future doesn't equal the past. This is, again, another sort of trap that the Marxists have laid, intellectually and otherwise, for people on the right. You don't just perpetuate a system indefinitely by creating oppressors and oppressed, right? By encaging people in a box. It's not the way it works. Human beings are too complex. As Jonathan Bloom has said, and I've quoted him many times because I think it's a brilliant quote, people say one thing, they think something else, and then they do something completely different. This is the nature of humanity. We are dynamic spiritual beings. So it's very difficult to contain us or to containerize us, despite their best efforts to do so. And so the future is going to look very different. You're going to see a return to the archetypes. You're going to see an awakening. You're going to see the very things that define Western civilization, that activated the animal spirits for the Greeks during the time of Homer. Those things are going to come back. You're going to see the rage of Achilles. And that's what you're beginning to see manifest at the street level across the Western world. Conflict, hardship, difficulty, that's what creates culture and civilization. It is not good times. It is not ease of mind. It is not pleasantness and passivity. It is not reason either. It is a sort of Dionysian energy, to use Nietzsche's term. It is an emotional energy that can't be controlled, that can't even really be described or articulated, because it's something that is transcendent, something that pertains to a world beyond a material construct. And remember that the foundation of the Marxist world and their worldview is materialism. Well, what happens when the most important, the most powerful forces in the world are imaginary forces that we can't measure or quantify? Well, that's when the models of the last 200 years, whether they're economic or political or psychical or what have you, it doesn't matter. That's when they break down. That's where they sort of reach their limit. And that's why I've talked about a resurgence of myth. Myth emanates from conflict. It's a vessel, it's a vehicle by which the archetypes can reassert themselves. And as I've said before on this channel many times, archetypes adapt. They assimilate. They manifest differently at all times. That's part of their power. And so the politics of today and going forward are going to look very, very different. The nature of charisma, the nature of influence, of persuasion, command presence, these things are going to look a lot different. But the archetypes that define who we are, that make us Western animals, humans, psycho-spiritual beings, those archetypes are going to reassert themselves and rebirth Western civilization in the process. And that means that we're headed for a reboot. We're headed for a renaissance. that we're going to see new art forms, that we're going to see new kind of religious movements. I'm not suggesting necessarily that they will be post-Christian. Maybe they will be a reactivated Christianity. Who knows? A new kind of spiritualism, to be sure. Maybe breakthroughs in science, technology, breakthroughs that completely redefined economy as we understand it today. That's the world that we're headed into, because the conflicts that we're experiencing, the breakdown of the systems that have been in place over the last couple hundred years, those systems have been holding us back, whether they're intellectual or material, right? I began this video essay talking about the Marxist framework, but there are many. This entire concept of banking itself has been a cancer that's spread around the world. It needs to be radiated, and I think that's going to happen. So too, our concepts of democracy, of governance, those things are going to change as well. And a lot of this is a modernization project. It's an upgrade, it's a reboot. So that is where we are headed. And all along the way, what has been communicated to us, alchemically or otherwise, these psychical earthquakes, things like Columbine, things like 2001, things like the global financial crisis in 2008 and COVID in 2020, or potentially a geopolitical war, who knows? All of these things, which I think were communicated to our collective unconscious with films like The Matrix and Fight Club, The Ninth Gate, Eyes Wide Shut, etc., etc. We are now going to see how deep the rabbit hole goes. We're going to expose the elites, and we're going to replace them. We're going to become the new elites. A counter elite is already apparent. It's already beginning to assert itself. But as I said before, that's going to look very different from the past. You know, in the past, elites were Teutonic knights. Then they became the bourgeois, right? Then they became the robber barons. What will the new elites be? Well, today's elites, it's very clear, are quintillionaires. They're effectively people that control concentrations of capital. There isn't anything particularly elite about that. And when the financial system goes, they will be wiped out. The new elite will be different, but they will come from our ranks because we have been initiated, because we have transformed all along the way. We were forced to. We didn't have a choice. We had to first experience the earthquake, the apocalypse. Then we had to go through the storm, the abyss, the dark night of the soul. We then had to find within ourselves the ability, the capacity to resist. Then we had to come together. We had to mass mobilize. And the final step that awaits us is the reboot. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.